Hey guys, tonight we're diving headfirst into a world where gods behave less like stoic statues and more like your overly dramatic aunt after a few too many mimosas. Imagine, if you will, the soft glow of your bedside lamp casting long, lazy shadows across your room, and the distant hum of, well, whatever distant hums you have going on. Perhaps it's the quiet drone of an air conditioner, or the faint whisper of traffic outside. You're snuggled in the blankets, just right, the pillow perfectly fluffed. But don't get too comfortable, because tonight we're plumbing the depths of Greek mythology, and honestly, you probably won't survive this level of pure, unadulterated boredom without drifting off. And that, my friends, is the goal. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story, or rather our sleepy wander through the ancient world, begins not with a bang, but with a flash. A really bright flash followed by a slightly awkward birth. We're talking about Dionysus, the god of wine, revelry, madness, and generally good times. But before he became the party animal of Olympus, he had a rather unconventional entry into the world. You see, his mother was a mortal woman named Semele, a princess of Thebes. Now Semele, bless her heart, somehow caught the eye of Zeus, the king of the gods, who, as we all know, had a bit of a reputation for dalliances outside of his divine marriage. Zeus, ever the smooth operator, would visit Semele in secret, cloaked in darkness, careful not to reveal his true divine form. Because, you know, mortals tend to spontaneously combust when exposed to the full glory of an Olympian god. It's a real fire hazard. But here's where the drama and a bit of a tragic misunderstanding kicks in. Hera, Zeus's notoriously jealous wife, eventually got wind of their affair. And when Hera gets wind of something, it's usually followed by a hurricane of divine fury. She decided to pay Semele a visit, disguised as an old kindly nursemaid. She started planting seeds of doubt in Semele's mind. "Are you sure he's a god, dearie?" she'd croon. "He only visits you in the dark." Sounds a bit suspicious, doesn't it? Maybe he's just some elaborate trickster, a mortal trying to pull a fast one. Semele, being human, and thus susceptible to nagging doubts, started to worry. She loved Zeus, but Hera's words chipped away at her certainty. Historians still argue whether Hera's manipulation was purely malicious or a twisted attempt to protect Semele from the inevitable, but the outcome was tragically clear. Driven by this newfound insecurity, Semele decided to confront Zeus. During one of his nocturnal visits, she made him swear an unbreakable oath by the river Styx, an oath even Zeus couldn't wiggle out of, that he would grant her one wish, any wish. And what did she wish for? Oh, just to see him in all his divine glory, just as he appeared to Hera. Zeus, caught in his own oath, was horrified. He knew what would happen. He tried to dissuade her, to explain the dangers, but Semele was insistent. Perhaps she thought she was special, or maybe she simply didn't grasp the sheer power of what she was asking for. It's like asking your friend to show you the sun up close. Sounds cool, but highly impractical for your eyeballs. So Zeus, bound by his word, revealed himself. And in a flash of lightning and a peal of thunder, Semele, a mere mortal, was incinerated. Just gone. Poof. It's a rather grim reminder that even the most well-intentioned requests can go horribly wrong when dealing with omnipotent beings. However, there was a twist in this fiery demise. Before Semele was completely consumed, Zeus managed to snatch the unborn child from her womb. This tiny premature fetus was Dionysus. You might think, well, that's a bit gruesome for a god of good times. And you'd be right. But then again, many Greek myths are less happily ever after, and more, oops, someone just got turned into a dolphin. This moment, the divine intervention to save the unborn Dionysus, is a cornerstone of his unique identity. He wasn't simply born of a god and a mortal. He was, in a very literal sense, twice born. First from his mother Semele, and then from his father Zeus, who, in a truly bizarre act of divine childcare, stitched the baby into his own thigh to complete its gestation. Yes, you heard that right. Zeus became a sort of walking, talking divine incubator. Imagine the awkward family dinners explaining that one to the other Olympians. Oh, little Dionysus. Yeah, he spent his last few months in my thigh. Don't ask. This peculiar birth, a mix of tragedy and extraordinary intervention, set Dionysus apart from the other Olympians, right from the very beginning. So there you are tucked into Zeus's thigh, which, let's be honest, is probably not the most comfortable birthing canal in the cosmos. But hey, at least it's warm. After a few months, or perhaps a few millennia, time is a bit fuzzy when you're gestating inside a god. Dionysus was finally ready to emerge. You'd think after all that drama, Zeus would cradle his newborn son, maybe sing him a lullaby, and then parade him around Olympus like a proud papa. But no, because remember, Hera is still out there seething with a divine rage that could curdle milk from here to eternity. Zeus knew he couldn't keep the baby Dionysus on Olympus. That would be like putting a freshly baked cookie in a room full of hungry toddlers. Disaster waiting to happen. So he entrusted the infant god to Hermes, the nimble messenger of the gods who, let's face it, probably had a cosmic baby carrier strapped to his winged sandals. Hermes' mission: get this child as far away from Hera's vengeful gaze as humanly, or rather divinely, possible. And where did Hermes take him? To a mythical land known as Nysa. Now, Nysa isn't a place you can find on Google Maps, even if you zoomed in really, really far. It's often described as a beautiful, lush valley, brimming with grapevines, which in hindsight makes perfect sense for Dionysus, shaded by fragrant trees and watered by sparkling streams. It was an idyllic hidden paradise, exactly the kind of place you'd want to raise a god. Baby away from his terrifying stepmother. Think of it as the ultimate off-grid childcare facility, complete with divine babysitters. Who were these divine babysitters, you ask? They were the nymphs of Nysa. These nature spirits, often depicted as young, beautiful maidens, were tasked with raising Dionysus in complete secrecy. They fed him honey ambrosia, the food of the gods, which probably tastes like a warm, sugary cloud, and whatever else a burgeoning deity needs to thrive. They probably taught him how to walk, how to coo, and how to avoid Hera's ever-watchful eye. It was a childhood steeped in nature, far from the intrigues and jealousies of Olympus. You can almost picture them playing peekaboo amongst the grapevines, the nymphs giggling as tiny Dionysus conjured a small, perfectly ripe bunch of grapes from thin air. Maybe they even invented the first divine baby food, pureed nectar, with a hint of mystic forest berries. Historians still argue whether Nysa was a single fixed location, or a general term for any secluded fertile place suitable for divine hiding. The truth is, its elusive nature probably helped keep Dionysus safe. This upbringing in Nyssa was crucial to shaping Dionysus's personality. Unlike the other Olympian gods who grew up in the grandeur and often rigid hierarchy of Olympus, Dionysus experienced a childhood of freedom, close to nature, surrounded by benevolent spirits. This perhaps explains his later affinity for wild, untamed spaces, his connection to the natural world, and his rather unconventional approach to divinity. While other gods were busy perfecting their stern gazes and pronouncements, Dionysus was probably learning to wrestle with satyrs and turn river water into a decent Chardonnay. Okay, maybe not Chardonnay specifically, but you get the idea. It's also worth noting that this period of hidden upbringing wasn't just a quaint pastoral interlude. It was a desperate measure. Hera's pursuit of Dionysus wasn't just a passing fit of pique, it was a long-term vendetta. She hated him not just because he was the product of Zeus's infidelity, but also because he represented a challenge to her authority and the established order. She saw him as an illegitimate pretender, a constant reminder of her husband's transgressions. And so the nymphs had to be perpetually vigilant, ensuring no whispers of the twice-born child reached Hera's ears. It was a divine game of hide-and-seek with cosmic consequences. Imagine the pressure on these nymphs. One slip-up, one careless word, and Hera could come crashing down on their peaceful valley, turning it into a desolate wasteland. You can almost hear their hushed warnings. Quiet, little one. No conjuring miniature lightning bolts today. Darling, Hera might be listening. This constant threat, this need for secrecy, undoubtedly instilled in Dionysus a certain wildness, a need for freedom, and a tendency to appear and disappear unexpectedly, much like a good party guest. It also perhaps fostered a sense of empathy for the marginalized, for those who exist outside the strictures of society, because he himself was, for a time, an outcast in the grand divine scheme of things. So there you have it, little Dionysus safely nestled in the verdant embrace of Nyssa, being raised by a cohort of nature nymphs. Sounds idyllic, right? A childhood of frolicking amongst grapevines, probably learning to make excellent flower crowns, and generally living a carefree existence. But you, dear listener, are probably already anticipating the storm clouds on the horizon. Because remember, Hera Zeus's long-suffering, perpetually enraged wife. Yeah, she doesn't forget. Not ever. Her divine memory is like an elephant's, but with added divine resentment and a penchant for turning people into cows. Hera's wrath wasn't a fleeting temper tantrum. It was a deep-seated, simmering fury that fueled a relentless, multi-pronged campaign against anyone or anything connected to Zeus's philandering. And Dionysus, being the living, breathing, twice-born embodiment of one of Zeus's indiscretions, was high on her cosmic hit list. She wouldn't rest until she had either destroyed him, or at the very least made his life utterly miserable. Think of her as the ancient Greek equivalent of a vengeful, all-seeing security camera, constantly scanning the mythological landscape for any sign of her husband's love children. Even hidden in Nyssa, under the watchful eyes of the nymphs, Dionysus wasn't entirely safe. Hera's reach was vast, her network of spies, both mortal and divine, seemingly endless. She had a knack for uncovering secrets, often through subtle whispers, manipulating lesser gods, or simply by her own sheer overwhelming will. It's a testament to the nymphs' dedication that they managed to keep Dionysus hidden for as long as they did. They were constantly on guard, devising ingenious hiding spots and employing various magical deceptions to throw Hera off the scent. Perhaps they had a cloaking spell that made the entire valley shimmer slightly, or maybe they just perfected the art of the divine misdirection. Oh, that's not a god baby, Hera. That's just a particularly loud goat. This constant threat of discovery, this looming shadow of Hera's vengeance, deeply impacted Dionysus's formative years. While he was surrounded by love and nature, there was always an undercurrent of danger, a need for vigilance. This might explain his later association with madness and ecstasy. Perhaps it was a coping mechanism, a way to escape the constant fear. Or maybe it simply reflects the chaotic energy he had to embody to survive such a perilous infancy. Just a typical divine childhood. Historians still argue whether Hera's relentless persecution was entirely personal or also a means to uphold the divine order and sanctity of marriage in the Olympian pantheon. Either way, it was bad news for Dionysus. There's a peculiar tidbit here sometimes to further confuse Hera. The nymphs would reportedly disguise Dionysus as a girl. Imagine the scene: little Dionysus, already showing signs of his future divine power, perhaps accidentally sprouting tiny grapevines from his baby blanket dressed in a frilly tunic, his divine giggles echoing through the secret groves. It's a slightly comical image, but it highlights the extreme lengths taken to protect him. This act of gender swapping might also be a quirky explanation for Dionysus's later association with fluidity masks and the blurring of boundaries. After all, if you spent your early years pretending to be someone you're not to avoid, your terrifying aunt, you'd probably develop a nuanced understanding of identity. The nymphs, however, couldn't protect him forever. As Dionysus grew, his innate divine powers began to manifest more strongly. It's hard to keep a burgeoning god under wraps, especially one destined to be the god of uninhibited revelry. The very air around him probably started to hum with a subtle, intoxicating energy. Grapes might have spontaneously ripened, and fountains might have occasionally flowed with a suspiciously potent, bubbly liquid. These nascent displays of power, no matter how subtle, would eventually draw Hera's attention. It's like trying to hide a supernova behind a bedsheet. Eventually, someone's going to notice the sudden increase in light and heat. Eventually, Hera did find him. Or rather, she came very, very close. The exact details vary in different tellings. Sometimes she sends a monstrous creature. Sometimes she simply finds the location through sheer divine willpower. But the result is always the same. Dionysus, still a child, is forced to flee. This isn't just a brief flight. It's the beginning of a pattern, a lifelong journey of wandering and seeking refuge, often disguised, often misunderstood. It's a nomadic existence for a nascent god, constantly one step ahead of cosmic retribution. This early period of being hunted and hidden deeply imprinted itself on Dionysus. It made him a god of outsiders, a deity who understood what it meant to be an outcast, to be rejected, and to find solace in the company of those who embraced his wild and unconventional ways. It's also why even when he achieves his full divine glory, there's always a hint of the wanderer about him, the one who doesn't quite fit neatly into the rigid structure of the Olympian family. He carries the weight of that early perilous childhood with him, forever influencing his actions and his unique domain. Alright, so Dionysus, a celestial toddler on the run, is now forced to leave the relative safety of Nysa. This is where things start to get interesting, because even as a fugitive child, the innate powers of a god, especially this god, are impossible to suppress. You see, while other deities might have been busy perfecting their thunderbolts, or mastering the art of the perfect sunset, Dionysus was quietly, almost inadvertently, beginning to manifest his dominion over the vine, over revelry, and over the kind of ecstatic liberation that makes you want to dance on tables, even if those tables are made of ancient Greek marble. As he was moved from one hiding place to another, constantly one step ahead of Hera's relentless pursuit, Dionysus started to exhibit his peculiar gifts. Imagine him a child wandering through unfamiliar landscapes, and everywhere he went, life seemed to burst forth with a new kind of vibrancy. Where his tiny feet touched the ground, perhaps grapevines would spontaneously sprout, their tendrils curling upwards, laden with fat, juicy grapes. Fountains might inexplicably begin to flow with wine instead of water, much to the delight and likely confusion of any passing shepherd or unsuspecting goat. It was like living with a walking, talking divine party trick. These weren't deliberate acts of divine power. At first, not like Zeus smiting someone with a lightning bolt. No, these were more like involuntary manifestations, the nascent stirrings of a god waking up to his true nature. It's like when you're a kid and you first realize you can whistle or snap your fingers. You're not trying to do it. It just happens, and then you experiment with it. For Dionysus, these experiments involved accidentally turning small puddles into puddles of something much more intoxicating. You can imagine the nymphs still diligently trying to hide him, whispering, "Oh, for Hera's sake, Dionysus, please stop turning the milk sour. And for the love of all that's holy, no more spontaneous grape arbors in the bedroom." This early connection to the vine and its intoxicating fruit is central to Dionysus's identity. While other gods had clear defined roles, Athena for wisdom, Ares for war, Dionysus was carving out a niche that was less about rigid structure and more about boundless experience. His domain wasn't just about agriculture. It was about the release that came from consuming the vine's bounty. It was about letting go, shedding inhibitions, and experiencing a deeper, more primal connection to the world. And it all started with these early, almost accidental displays of power. This period also saw the development of his entourage, though in a much more nascent form. Animals, particularly leopards and panthers, seemed drawn to him, perhaps sensing his wild, untamed nature. And of course, the satyrs and maenads, his future companions, might have started to appear, drawn by the subtle, magnetic pull of his burgeoning divine energy. The satyrs, those half-human, half-goat creatures with their love for wine and music, would have been natural companions. And the maenads, the wild, ecstatic female devotees, embody the very spirit of his revelry. Historians still argue whether the concept of the maenads predates Dionysus or developed in conjunction with his evolving cult. What's certain is that their untamed energy became inextricably linked with him. Think about the sheer impact of these early manifestations. Imagine a remote, dry village struggling to grow anything, and then suddenly a child passes through, and grapevines spring up, laden with fruit, turning arid land into fertile ground. This wasn't just magic. It was a promise, a hint of abundance of joy, and of a transformation that could elevate human experience. It was also undoubtedly very confusing for the locals. We prayed to Demeter for wheat, and instead we got this rather potent beverage. Well, I suppose it's better than nothing. One quirky tidbit about this stage. Some myths suggest that even at this young age, Dionysus had a peculiar effect on milk. Instead of simply turning it into wine, which, let's be honest, would be quite a feat for a baby, he could make it flow in abundance from surprising sources: rocks, trees, even thin air. This imagery of overflowing milk and wine becomes a recurring motif in his later myths, symbolizing the fertility and plenty that he brings. It's almost as if the very essence of nature was joyfully responding to his presence, eager to share its bounty in a truly whimsical way. So while Hera was busy sending out divine search parties and plotting elaborate curses, Dionysus was in his own way building the foundations of his future worship. He was showing the world, albeit subtly, that there was a different kind of divinity, one that embraced chaos joy and the intoxicating liberation of the spirit rather than the stern decrees and rigid structures of the Olympians. He was becoming the god who promised escape not just from earthly woes, but from the very confines of the self. And he was doing it all while probably still being a little wobbly on his tiny divine feet. So little Dionysus, with his accidental grape-sprouting powers and growing entourage of slightly unhinged nature spirits, was proving rather difficult to hide permanently. Hera, bless her persistent heart, was closing in. Zeus, ever the protective if somewhat negligent father, had to make another executive decision about his precocious, thigh-born son. The solution: send him far, far away. And by far, far away, we're talking ancient world equivalent of sending someone to a different continent. A journey that would kick off Dionysus's grand tour of the ancient world. Specifically, a journey to Egypt. Now you might think, Egypt. Why Egypt? Well, at the time, Egypt was a land of ancient wisdom, powerful pharaohs, and a pantheon of gods quite unlike the Olympians. It was a place of mystique, immense wealth, and well, a good place to get lost if you're a divine toddler on the run. Think of it as the ultimate witness protection program, but with more pyramids and fewer federal agents. Hermes, again, probably played the role of divine travel agent, whisking Dionysus away, likely disguised in some unassuming form. Perhaps as a very peculiar, unusually charismatic camel. This journey to Egypt wasn't just a brief layover. It was a significant chapter in Dionysus's development. Here in the land of the Nile, he would have encountered different cultures, different customs, and entirely new ways of understanding the divine. Imagine him, a young god, absorbing the rich tapestry of Egyptian mythology, witnessing their elaborate rituals, and perhaps even picking up a few new tricks from their gods of fertility and resurrection. It's like a divine exchange program, but without the awkward host family dinners. While in Egypt, Dionysus is said to have been taught various mysteries and rituals, which he later incorporated into his own cult. This suggests a blending of cultures, a cross-pollination of religious ideas that was quite common in the ancient world. You can almost see him sitting cross-legged attentively, listening to an Egyptian priest explain the cycles of life and death, nodding thoughtfully, perhaps even making a mental note about how he could incorporate that into his next big party. This cultural immersion explains why elements of Dionysian worship, particularly those related to death and rebirth, often feel distinct from the more straightforward cults of other Olympians. Historians still argue about the extent of Egyptian influence on Greek religious practices, but for Dionysus, it seems quite pronounced. One quirky tidbit from this Egyptian sojourn: some accounts suggest that Dionysus in his travels either encountered or was even identified with the Egyptian god Osiris. Osiris, as you might know, was also a god associated with fertility agriculture, especially grain, not just grapes, death and resurrection. Both gods experienced dismemberment. Osiris famously and Dionysus symbolically, through various myths of sparagmos or ritual tearing apart, and both were associated with ecstatic religious practices. This syncretism, the blending of two distinct deities into one, speaks volumes about Dionysus's adaptable nature and his ability to resonate with different cultures. It's like finding your favorite band's music has been remixed by a legendary DJ. Same core, but with a whole new vibe. This period in Egypt marks the beginning of Dionysus's active role as a god who travels and spreads his influence. He's no longer just a hidden child. He's becoming a missionary of mirth, a divine ambassador of grape juice and good times. His journey isn't just about escaping Hera, it's about fulfilling his destiny, which involves bringing the gift of wine and its associated ecstatic liberation to humanity. And let's be honest, humanity probably needed it. Imagine ancient Greece before wine. It was probably all just olives and philosophical debates, which sounds a bit dull after a while. So Dionysus, after absorbing what he could from the land of the pharaohs, would eventually move on. His stay in Egypt wasn't permanent, but it was formative. It laid the groundwork for his reputation as a cosmopolitan god, one whose influence transcended the strict geographical boundaries of Greece. It showed that his domain wasn't limited to a specific region or a particular people, but was universal, embracing all who were willing to partake in his joyful, liberating mysteries. And it also showed that Hera's reach, while vast, wasn't infinite. She could chase him, but she couldn't stop him from evolving, from learning, and from ultimately becoming the vibrant, transformative force he was destined to be. From the ancient lands of Egypt, Dionysus's divine wanderings continued, pushing him further east, beyond the familiar horizons of the Mediterranean world. His next significant stop, according to many myths, was India. Yes, you heard that right, India. It's quite a geographical leap for a Greek god. But then again, divine travel agents probably have a different concept of local. This journey isn't just a quirky footnote. It underscores Dionysus's truly global, for the ancient world anyway, influence and the universal nature of his domain. He wasn't just a god for the Greeks. He was a god for anyone who yearned for liberation, for ecstasy, and for a really good time with some fermented grapes. Imagine the scene: Dionysus, perhaps no longer a mere child, but a vibrant, youthful deity, traversing vast deserts and towering mountain ranges, probably on the back of a majestic beast, a panther perhaps, or even an elephant. This wasn't some quick hop. It was an arduous expedition. He wasn't just showing up. He was undertaking a grand, transformative pilgrimage. And as he went, he didn't just passively observe. He actively spread the cultivation of the vine and the mysteries of his worship. This was in many ways his divine mission taking full form. In India, Dionysus encountered cultures vastly different from those in Egypt or Greece. He faced new challenges, new forms of resistance, and new opportunities for his unique brand of divinity to take root. Some legends even speak of him leading an army not of warriors, but of his ecstatic followers, the Maenads and satyrs, conquering lands not with swords, but with song dance and the intoxicating power of wine. It sounds like the world's most chaotic yet strangely effective peace treaty. Yield to the grape, or we'll simply party until you join us. This idea of Dionysus leading a triumphant procession through foreign lands highlights his missionary zeal. He wasn't just bestowing a gift. He was actively converting people to his way of life, convincing them of the joy and freedom that came with embracing his cult. And given that he was introducing something as universally appealing as wine, it's probably safe to say he had a fairly high conversion rate. You try telling someone who's been drinking water all their life that there's a magical liquid that makes you feel like dancing. They'd probably sign up immediately. A mainstream historical fact here: the Greeks themselves were fascinated by India, a land they often viewed as exotic and mysterious. Alexander the Great's campaigns extended into India centuries after these myths were first told, suggesting a persistent Greek interest in the East. These Dionysian myths might have served as a mythological precursor to those historical expeditions, a way for the Greeks to conceptualize their own connection to distant lands and cultures. Historians still argue whether Dionysus's Indian adventures were purely mythological, or if they reflect some very early unrecorded cultural exchanges between the Greek world and the Indian subcontinent. It's certainly a stretch, but an intriguing one. One quirky or fringe tidbit: some myths claim that in India, Dionysus learned the art of prophecy from a wise Indian king, or that he was worshipped alongside existing Indian deities, creating a fascinating blend of religious practices. Imagine an ancient Indian scroll depicting Dionysus, with his thyrsus dancing alongside, say, a local deity with multiple arms. It speaks to the universal human desire for transcendence and altered states, which Dionysus, in his own way, perfectly embodied. The adventures in India were not always smooth sailing, of course. Dionysus, despite his divine powers, still faced resistance. Not everyone was keen on embracing his wild, often chaotic rituals. There would have been kings and rulers who saw his influence as a threat to their established order, preferring rigid hierarchies over ecstatic liberation. But Dionysus, being Dionysus, had his ways of dealing with such naysayers, as we'll soon see when he returns closer to home. His journey through India cemented his identity as a universal god, one whose message transcended borders and whose power could transform both individuals and entire societies. He was truly the original influencer centuries before Instagram, having spread his particular brand of divine revelry across the exotic landscapes of India. Dionysus eventually began his journey back towards the familiar shores of the Greek world. But don't imagine a quiet, thoughtful return. Oh no. Dionysus, ever the dramatic one, was coming back with a mission to establish his worship definitively in his homeland. And as you might expect when a god of wine and madness tries to introduce himself, not everyone rolled out the red carpet. In fact, some rolled out the metaphorical "beware of god-bearing strangers" mat. One such unfortunate soul was King Lycurgus of Thrace. Now Lycurgus was a king, and like many kings in ancient myths, he was a bit set in his ways. He was known for his piety towards the traditional gods, his strict adherence to order, and perhaps most notably, his intense dislike of anything new or disruptive. And Dionysus, with his wild followers, his intoxicating wine, and his general air of divine chaos, was practically the embodiment of everything Lycurgus disdained. It was a clash of cultures, a collision of order versus exuberance, and frankly, it was never going to end well for the king. It's like inviting a rock band to play at a library's quiet reading hour. Someone's going to get upset. The story goes that Dionysus, in his travels, arrived in Thrace bringing with him the gift of the vine. He probably offered it with all the enthusiasm of a proud sommelier, expecting gratitude and acceptance. Instead, Lycurgus, filled with hubris and a profound ignorance of who he was dealing with, outright rejected him. Some versions say he imprisoned Dionysus's followers, the Maenads, or even Dionysus himself. Others claim he tried to destroy the grapevines, fearing the intoxicating effects of the wine and the unrest it might bring. He probably saw Dionysus as nothing more than a traveling charlatan, a mere mortal trying to trick his people with strange rituals and a potent new beverage. This, of course, was a rather grave miscalculation. You see, attacking a god, especially one who controls your mind and senses, is generally ill-advised. Dionysus, as you're probably sensing by now, doesn't do mild annoyance. He does divine retribution with a flair for the dramatically tragic. And Lycurgus was about to get a front-row seat to that particular show. Dionysus cursed the king, driving him mad. This wasn't just a simple headache. It was a profound, terrifying insanity that warped Lycurgus's perception of reality. He became utterly delusional, seeing his own son Dryas as a vine needing to be pruned. Yes, you heard that right. His own flesh and blood transformed in his addled mind into a plant. In his madness, Lycurgus took an axe, and in a fit of terrifying, deluded fury, chopped his own son to pieces. Imagine the horror, the screams, the realization of what he had done. Once the divine madness lifted, if it ever truly did. It's a stark, brutal myth designed not just to entertain, but to warn. It screams, do not reject the god, do not deny his power. It's a very effective deterrent against future blasphemy, don't you think? Like a divine billboard saying, mess with Dionysus, lose your family. A mainstream historical fact here. The myth of Lycurgus is one of the earliest and most vivid examples of Dionysus's punitive power against those who resist his worship. It highlights a common theme in Greek mythology, the danger of hubris, or excessive pride, especially when directed against the gods. Lycurgus, in his arrogance, believed he could defy a divine force, and he paid the ultimate price. It's a classic cautionary tale, often reiterated in ancient Greek tragedies, reminding mortals of their place in the cosmic order. One quirky or fringe tidbit is that some accounts suggest Lycurgus was not just punished with madness, but also in certain versions physically bound by Dionysus, with a vine that grew impossibly fast, tightening around him. Or that he was subsequently killed by his own people, driven by famine, as the land itself suffered from Dionysus's wrath. This further emphasizes the god's connection to fertility and prosperity. Reject him, and the very land might turn against you. It adds a layer of collective punishment to Lycurgus's individual tragedy, painting a picture of divine power that affects entire communities. Historians still argue whether the Lycurgus myth represents a historical memory of a real clash between traditional Greek cults and the incoming, more ecstatic Dionysian worship, or if it's purely a symbolic narrative about the perils of resisting divine will. Regardless, its brutal efficiency in demonstrating Dionysus's power made it a cornerstone of his legend. The story of Lycurgus stands as a chilling testament to the severe consequences of denying Dionysus's divinity and rejecting the intoxicating freedom he offered. It taught people that sometimes it's just easier to embrace the party or risk becoming part of the cautionary tale. So Lycurgus learned the hard way that rejecting Dionysus was a shortcut to a very bad day indeed. But Dionysus wasn't just dealing with stubborn kings on land. Oh no, his divine journey, which remember began with him being smuggled away from Hera, meant he was still prone to unexpected detours and perilous encounters. And sometimes those encounters involved rather misguided mortals who thought they could outsmart a god. Enter the pirates. You know the kind with eye patches, bad teeth, and an unfortunate habit of underestimating their captives. The story goes that Dionysus, perhaps disguised as a handsome, wealthy youth, was making his way across the Aegean Sea. He might have been seeking passage on a merchant vessel, or perhaps he was simply lounging on a quiet beach, enjoying the sea breeze when a ship of Tyrrhenian pirates spotted him. These pirates, being the opportunistic scoundrels they were, saw an easy target. A well-dressed young man alone and seemingly unguarded jackpot. They swooped in, grabbed him, and dragged him aboard their ship, no doubt rubbing their hands together, already dreaming of the hefty ransom they'd collect. They probably thought he was some rich noble's son, perhaps heading to a vacation spot, utterly clueless about the true nature of their cargo. The crew, a rough-and-tumble bunch, immediately started discussing what to do with their prize. Most of them wanted to sail him to Egypt. Always Egypt, it seems to be the go-to place for selling valuable commodities in ancient times, and sell him into slavery. But the ship's helmsman, a man named Acoetes, was different. He was a more observant sort, and as he looked at their captive, something about the youth struck him as unusual. There was a certain regal bearing and unearthly glow, a strange serene power in his eyes that didn't belong to any mortal. He urged his shipmates to release the boy, warning them that he might be a god. "This is no ordinary boy," he might have shouted over the creaking timbers. "His eyes burn with the divine fire. We risk the wrath of Olympus." But the pirates, blinded by greed and arrogance, laughed him off. "What, you think we've captured a god?" they probably sneered. "He looks like he'd fetch a good price for his silk tunic alone." They ignored Acoetes' warnings, tied Dionysus up, though the ropes kept magically loosening a detail they probably dismissed as bad knots, and set sail for their nefarious destination. This, dear listeners, is where the story pivots from mundane piracy to divine spectacle. You do not ignore a helmsman who warns you about a god. It's like ignoring the blinking check engine light in your car, but with more potential for turning into a dolphin. Dionysus, tired of their insolence, decided it was time to reveal his true power. The ship, once a sturdy vessel, began to undergo a terrifying transformation. Thick green ivy suddenly sprouted from the masts, twining around the sails and rigging laden with heavy clusters of grapes. The oars turned into serpents, hissing and coiling, their scales shimmering in the sunlight. The air filled with the sounds of flutes and pipes, ghostly music that resonated with a primal energy, driving the terrified pirates to the brink of madness. Imagine the sheer, disorienting horror, your ship turning into a floating vineyard, your oars becoming snakes, and the very air vibrating with unseen intoxicating rhythms. The pirates, gripped by panic and the encroaching madness, started leaping overboard in sheer terror. As they hit the water, they were instantly transformed into dolphins. Yes, dolphins. It's a rather specific, yet oddly poetic form of divine punishment. Forever condemned to swim the seas, perhaps still bearing a faint internal memory of their greedy human lives. It's a mainstream historical fact that dolphins were often seen as sacred creatures in ancient Greece, sometimes associated with specific deities, and this myth provides a mythic origin for their friendly nature towards humans, a subtle reminder of their past lives. Only Acoetes, the wise helmsman, was spared. He alone recognized the god and showed him due respect. Dionysus revealed his true divine form to Acoetes and commended him for his wisdom and reverence. Acoetes, suitably terrified and humbled, steered the now transformed ship, now a magnificent vessel adorned with vines, back to shore. He went on to become a priest of Dionysus, spreading the god's worship and telling the cautionary tale of the pirates. Historians still argue about the precise geographical origin of the Tyrrhenian pirates in this myth. Were they Etruscan, or simply a generic term for seafaring raiders? The specific origin matters less than their fateful encounter with divine power. This episode with the pirates is a crucial one. It showcases Dionysus's dual nature, not just the benevolent giver of wine and joy, but also a formidable, vengeful deity when provoked. It highlights his unpredictable, often terrifying power, and his absolute intolerance for disrespect. It's a quirky tidbit that the choice of dolphins might reflect the fluidity and boundary-crossing nature of Dionysus himself, moving between land and sea, human and animal. It serves as another powerful lesson: you can try to kidnap a god, but you're probably just going to end up swimming with the fishes, quite literally. And honestly, for a pirate, being turned into a dolphin might be a step up from their usual career trajectory. Having taught the Tyrrhenian pirates a rather unforgettable lesson in divine respect, a lesson they're still probably contemplating between leaps out of the water, Dionysus finally began his determined return to Greece. This wasn't just a casual visit. It was a grand re-entry, a triumphal homecoming for a god who had matured through his travels and was now ready to claim his rightful place. He was coming back not just as a wanderer, but as the undisputed bearer of one of humanity's most transformative gifts: wine. Imagine him stepping onto the sun-drenched shores of Greece, perhaps near Attica or Boeotia, not alone but surrounded by his ever-growing entourage. There would be the joyous flute-playing satyrs, their hooves clattering on the ancient stones, their eyes twinkling with mischief. And the maenads, those wild, ecstatic women, clad in fawn skins with their hair unbound and their thyrsi, staffs entwined with ivy and topped with pine cones, held aloft. The air would be thick with the scent of grapes, pine, and something indefinably wild and free. It was less a quiet arrival, and more a flash mob of divine proportions, ready to unleash a sensory explosion on the unsuspecting Greeks. His mission was clear: to introduce the cultivation of the vine and the mysteries of wine to his homeland. Before Dionysus, the Greeks certainly had drinks mostly water-milk, or perhaps some watered-down barley brew. But wine, in its full, intoxicating glory, was something new, something that would fundamentally alter their society, their rituals, and their very perception of reality. It was like bringing Wi-Fi to a village that still relied on smoke signals, a game changer in every sense of the word. This introduction wasn't simply about handing over a bottle, it was about teaching viticulture, how to plant the vines, how to prune them, how to harvest the grapes, and crucially, how to ferment them into that magical elixir. It was a painstaking process, requiring patience and a deep understanding of nature. And Dionysus, despite his wild reputation, was also a god of agriculture and the rhythms of the earth. He was the divine winemaker, perfecting the process that would bring both joy and, if misused, chaos. A mainstream historical fact here, while wine was certainly consumed in the ancient Near East long before Dionysus's mythological return to Greece, the Greeks truly adopted viticulture and made it a cornerstone of their culture. Wine became integral to their symposia drinking parties for philosophical discussion, their religious ceremonies, and their daily lives. The spread of Greek colonies throughout the Mediterranean often coincided with the spread of grape cultivation. So in a sense, Dionysus's mythological journey mirrors the very real historical diffusion of winemaking technology. Historians still argue about the exact origins of wine cultivation in the Aegean, and how much was indigenous development versus influence from the Near East. Of course, introducing a substance that could alter perception and lead to ecstatic states wasn't always met with open arms. Remember, Lycurgus. His reaction was typical of those who resisted. Many Greeks were wary of the strangeness of Dionysus's cult, the ecstatic dance, the abandonment of self, the blurring of social distinctions that occurred during his rituals. They preferred their gods to be predictable, their rituals orderly, and their social structures intact. Dionysus, however, offered something fundamentally different, a temporary escape from those very structures. One quirky tidbit about his return. In some accounts, Dionysus first presented the gift of wine to a mortal named Icarius in Attica. Icarius, overjoyed by this wondrous new beverage, shared it with his fellow villagers. However, they unfamiliar with the effects of fermented grapes drank too much, mistook their intoxication for poisoning, and in a fit of panic and rage killed Icarius. This tragic misunderstanding highlights the initial fear and ignorance surrounding wine, and Dionysus later intervened, turning Icarius into the constellation Botas and his daughter Erigone into Virgo, so their story would forever be told among the stars. It's a rather unfortunate first impression for such a delightful beverage. Despite these initial bumps, Dionysus persisted. His presence in Greece wasn't just about bringing a drink, it was about introducing a new way of experiencing the divine, a path to transcendence through intoxication and ritual. He challenged the established order, urging people to embrace the wilder, more primal aspects of their nature. And in doing so, he laid the groundwork for his enduring legacy as a god who brought not just joy and revelry, but also profound, sometimes terrifying insights into the human condition. He was here, he was divine, and he had grapes. And trust me, you wanted those grapes. So Dionysus is back on Greek soil, trailing grapevines and good vibes, and he's ready to introduce the grand innovation wine. This isn't just about offering a new beverage, it's about fundamentally altering human consciousness, social structures, and religious practice. Think of it as the ultimate disruptor. Centuries before anyone even conceived of a startup, Dionysus wasn't just a god, he was a revolutionary, and his revolution came in a cup. The process of introducing wine wasn't always smooth, as we briefly touched upon with poor Icarius. Imagine for a moment a world where the most potent drink you knew was water or a slightly fermented grain gruel. Then suddenly, a charismatic, somewhat flamboyant god rolls into town, offering you a drink that makes your head spin. Your inhibitions melt away, and your feet inexplicably want to dance. Some people, like Icarius's neighbors, would naturally be alarmed, mistaking the effects for poison or madness. Others, however, would be utterly captivated. Dionysus didn't just drop off some grapes and a fermentation manual. He actively taught humanity the entire process of viticulture and winemaking. This involved understanding the delicate balance of nature, the sun's warmth, the richness of the soil, the rhythm of the seasons. He showed them how to plant the cuttings, how to nurture the young vines, how to prune them to ensure bountiful yields, and how to harvest the ripe grapes. Then came the magic, the crushing of the grapes, the bubbling fermentation, and the patient waiting for the raw juice to transform into the intoxicating elixir. This wasn't quick magic. It was agriculture mixed with divine blessing. This profound gift transformed ancient Greek society. Wine became more than just a drink. It became a cultural cornerstone. It was central to the symposium, the all-male drinking party, where philosophical discussions, poetry recitation, and general merriment took place. It was believed to loosen inhibitions, spark creativity, and facilitate deeper thought, or at least make you think your thoughts were deeper. It was consumed at religious festivals, used in libations to the gods, and offered in social gatherings. A mainstream historical fact is that the Greeks often drank their wine diluted with water, a practice that both made it last longer and prevented excessive intoxication, distinguishing their refined consumption from the perceived barbarism of undiluted wine drinkers. Historians still argue about the precise alcohol content of ancient Greek wine, but it was certainly potent enough to cause quite a stir. Dionysus's gift wasn't merely a practical one. It had a deeply spiritual dimension. Wine in his cult was seen as a way to achieve ecstasy, not just drunken revelry, but a state of being outside oneself. Ecstasis, a temporary transcendence of the everyday. Through wine and ritual dance, his followers, particularly the Maenads, sought to merge with the divine, to experience a primal, uninhibited connection to the god himself. It was a release, a liberation from the constraints of society, a chance to tap into something ancient and wild within the human spirit. Of course, this wild freedom could also be dangerous. The line between ecstatic bliss and destructive madness could be thin, a point that later myths vividly illustrate. Dionysus's gift, while wondrous, carried a potent warning. It demanded respect, and if abused or rejected, could lead to dire consequences. It's like giving someone a sports car. It's exhilarating and powerful, but if you don't know how to handle it, you might end up in a ditch. One quirky or fringe tidbit is that some myths suggest Dionysus's gift of wine wasn't solely benevolent. It was also a way to reveal the true nature of humanity. Those who embraced it with moderation and reverence found joy and inspiration. Those who abused it or rejected it out of fear met with misfortune. This adds a layer of moral complexity to his seemingly straightforward gift, suggesting a divine wisdom in its very essence. Perhaps it was less about the drink itself and more about how humanity chose to wield such a powerful tool of transformation. So Dionysus, the twice-born god, having journeyed across continents, enduring persecution, and challenging traditional norms, finally established his domain in Greece. He didn't just introduce a crop, he introduced a culture, a philosophy, and a profound pathway to human experience. The grape, once a simple fruit, became a symbol of divine power, of liberation, and of the joyous, sometimes terrifying depths of the human soul. And all because a god decided that water was just a little too bland. All right, so Dionysus has brought the gift of wine to Greece, and it's slowly but surely changing everything. Some embrace it with joyous abandon, others with cautious reverence, and then there are those who simply refuse to get with the program. Our next stop takes us to Thebes, a city familiar from many Greek myths, and to its unfortunate king Pentheus. Pentheus, like Lycurgus before him, was not a fan of this new disruptive god and his intoxicating rituals. He was a stickler for order, a proponent of tradition, and frankly, a bit of a control freak. This, as you've probably guessed, did not bode well for him. Dionysus, having traveled far and wide, eventually arrived in Thebes, which happened to be the very birthplace of his mortal mother, Semele. You'd think a homecoming would be a cause for celebration, perhaps a parade. But Pentheus, his cousin, and the reigning king had a massive chip on his shoulder. He considered Dionysus's cult to be nothing more than a foreign aberration, a degenerate fad involving unruly women and drunken excess. He simply couldn't fathom a god who didn't fit the traditional mold of a stern Olympian deity. He saw the Maenads, Dionysus's ecstatic female followers, as a threat to public decency and social order, running wild in the hills, singing and dancing completely unbound by conventional modesty. Pentheus, in his supreme arrogance and blind piety to the old ways, flat out denied Dionysus's divinity. He refused to recognize him as a god, dismissing his claims as charlatanism. He even went so far as to arrest some of Dionysus's followers, including the Tiresias, the venerable blind prophet who had actually warned him against this very course of action. This, as we've learned, is a cardinal sin in Greek mythology, denying a god's power, especially to their face. It's like telling your cat you don't believe it's the supreme ruler of your house. It knows, and there will be consequences. Dionysus, ever patient in his initial attempts, tried to reason with Pentheus. He even allowed himself to be captured and brought before the king, appearing as a calm, persuasive priest of his own cult. He explained his divinity, described his mysteries, and offered Pentheus the chance to embrace the new worship. But Pentheus, hardened by his prejudice and convinced of his own superior judgment, remained obdurate. He mocked Dionysus, threatened him, and ordered him imprisoned, believing he had successfully put an end to this troublesome new cult. Talk about a lack of foresight. But Dionysus, being the god of illusion and liberation, effortlessly escaped his shackles. His prison cell spontaneously opened, the ground shook, and flames briefly erupted in the palace, signaling the presence of undeniable divine power. This only further enraged Pentheus, driving him deeper into his stubborn delusion. He was determined to stop the cult, even if it meant resorting to extreme measures. He just couldn't comprehend that some forces are simply beyond mortal control. A mainstream historical fact is that Euripides's play, the Bacchae, which means the Maenads, written in the 5th century BCE, is the most famous and chilling account of the Pentheus myth. It serves as a powerful dramatic exploration of the conflict between order and chaos, reason and ecstasy, and the terrible consequences of resisting divine will. This play is still performed today, reminding us of the enduring power of these ancient stories. Historians still argue whether Euripides intended the play as a warning against Dionysian excess or as a defense of his worship, given its brutal depiction of divine retribution. The climax of this tragic tale is one of the most gruesome in Greek mythology. Dionysus, seeing that persuasion was useless, decided to teach Pentheus a lesson he'd never forget, or rather one he'd forget very quickly, being dead and all. Dionysus played upon Pentheus's morbid curiosity and his desire to spy on the Maenads' secret rituals. He convinced the king to disguise himself as a woman to infiltrate their rites on Mount Cithaeron, promising him a glimpse of their forbidden activities. Pentheus, perhaps driven by a mix of curiosity and a desire to catch them in an act of depravity, fell for the trap. Once on the mountain, Dionysus caused Pentheus's disguise to slip. The Maenads, driven into a frenzy by Dionysus, perceived Pentheus not as their king, but as a wild animal, a lion or a boar, something to be torn apart in their ecstatic ritual of sparagmos. And among these frenzied women was Pentheus's own mother, Agave, who in her divine madness led the charge. They tore him limb from limb, literally dismembering him, and Agave proudly carried his head back to Thebes, believing it to be the head of a lion she had hunted. It's a horrifying image, a chilling depiction of the destructive power of divine madness when unleashed upon the unbelieving. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that the Maenads in their frenzy were sometimes said to acquire superhuman strength, able to tear apart animals, uproot trees, and even shatter rocks. This emphasizes the transformative power of Dionysian ecstasy, capable of turning ordinary individuals into forces of nature, but also the terrifying loss of control that accompanied it. Only when the madness lifted and she saw the gruesome reality of what she held in her hands did Agave realize her horrific deed. The tragedy of Pentheus is a stark, brutal demonstration of Dionysus's power and his intolerance for those who deny his divinity. It's a terrifying lesson in humility, a reminder that some forces, especially divine ones, cannot be reasoned with, controlled, or simply wished away. Sometimes you just have to respect the god, or become a cautionary tale in a future history script. You've just witnessed the brutal dismembering end of poor misguided Pentheus, a stark reminder that when Dionysus throws a party, you don't refuse the invitation. Or more accurately, when he demands recognition, you don't deny it. But the story of divine retribution doesn't end there, because it seems some mortals just couldn't learn their lesson, or perhaps Hera's influence was still subtly twisting minds. Our next cautionary tale involves the Vineyards, 3 sisters who made the fatal mistake of rejecting Dionysus and his ecstatic worship. The Vineyards were the daughters of King Minyas of Orchomenus, a city in Boeotia not far from Thebes. Their names were Alcathoe Leucippe and Arcippe, though sometimes referred to simply as the daughters of Minyas. Unlike the wild, uninhibited Maenads, who embraced Dionysus's call, the Vineyards were paragons of traditional female virtues. They preferred to stay at home, diligently weaving and spinning, attending to their domestic duties. They were devout followers of the more established goddesses, like Athena and Hera, and scoffed at the new foreign cult of Dionysus, viewing it as chaotic, immoral, and a distraction from proper orderly life. They probably saw the Maenads dancing in the hills and muttered, "Honestly, can't they find a nice hobby, like embroidery?" When Dionysus's message reached Orchomenus, calling for all women to abandon their looms and join his revels on the mountains, the Minyards steadfastly refused. They remained in their homes, their hands busy with their weaving, their minds stubbornly closed to the intoxicating siren song of the god. They probably thought, "We're far too sensible for such nonsense. Someone has to keep the economy going while everyone else is running wild." This might seem like a perfectly reasonable decision from a modern perspective, staying in and being productive instead of joining a possibly tipsy mountain dance party. But for Dionysus, it was an unforgivable slight, a direct challenge to his authority and the universal nature of his gift. Dionysus, ever the patient persuader, before becoming the terrifying punisher, first sent a priestess to them urging them to embrace his cult. When they still refused, he appeared to them in various guises, first as a beautiful maiden, then as a bull lion or a leopard demonstrating his shape-shifting power. He filled their house with the aroma of wine and the sound of flutes, causing their weaving shuttles to sprout ivy and their milk to turn into wine. It was a full sensory assault, a divine nudge, if you will, to get them to join the party. But the Minyards, in their stubborn piety, remained unmoved, their minds fixed on their looms and their disdain for the god unwavering. This unwavering rejection, this denial of his very essence, finally pushed Dionysus past his divine patience. He inflicted them with madness. This wasn't just a fit of pique. It was a profound, consuming insanity that mirrored the very ecstasy they had refused to embrace. Their domestic orderly world shattered. They became convinced that they too had to participate in a wild hunt, but their minds, warped by divine fury, turned on their own. In their madness, they saw the youngest sister's child, Hippasus, as a calf or a fawn, and in a horrifying echo of the Pentheus myth, they tore him limb from limb, mirroring the ritual sparagmos they had scorned. Imagine the screams, the terror, the ultimate violation of their own nature. These women who valued order and domesticity above all else were driven to commit the most unspeakable act of savagery against their own blood. The very virtues they held dear were utterly destroyed by the god they rejected. It's a chilling example of what happens when divine power, when denied, turns inward and consumes the denier. A mainstream historical fact here is that this myth, like that of Pentheus, highlights the dangers of refusing to acknowledge Dionysian power and the destructive potential of unchecked religious fervor, whether divine or human. After their horrific act, the Minyards themselves were transformed. Some versions say they were turned into bats, forever condemned to fly only at night, avoiding the light of day, perhaps symbolizing their rejection of the light of Dionysian revelation. Others say they were turned into screech owls, or simply lost their minds completely and wandered the earth as wild, tormented creatures. This transformation is a symbolic punishment, eternally marking them as examples of those who defied the god. Historians still argue whether the Minyard's fate represents a broader critique of traditional female roles in ancient Greece, or merely reinforces the dangers of hubris in the face of divine power. One quirky or fringe tidbit is that the Minyards, despite their tragic end, were sometimes seen as figures representing the triumph of divine will over human stubbornness. Their transformation into bats or owls suggests a liminal state, forever trapped between their former human lives and the wild nocturnal world that Dionysus embodies. It's a subtle reminder that even in rejection, they still became intertwined with his domain, albeit in a dark, twisted form. The tale of the Minyards serves as yet another powerful warning, reinforcing the lesson of Lycurgus and Pentheus. Dionysus demands recognition, not just outward worship, but an internal acceptance of the wild, ecstatic, and transformative aspects of life. To deny him is to invite not just punishment, but a terrifying inversion of one's own nature. And honestly, given the choice between a little harmless revelry and turning into a bat after eating your own child, I think most people would choose the former. Just a thought. Having dealt with the stubbornly traditional and the tragically misguided, Dionysus continued his divine journey, bringing his gifts and his demanding presence to various corners of the ancient world. But not all his interactions were about violent retribution. Sometimes his path intertwined with others in moments of profound sadness, offering salvation rather than destruction. And one such poignant tale involves the beautiful Princess Ariadne. You might remember Ariadne from her starring role in the dramatic saga of Theseus and the Minotaur. Well, her story takes a rather heartbreaking turn, only to be gloriously redeemed by our favorite god of wine. Imagine the scene: the island of Naxos, a rocky sun-baked outcrop in the Aegean Sea. The hero Theseus, having famously slain the Minotaur in the labyrinth of Crete with Ariadne's crucial help, was sailing home with her and the other rescued Athenian youths. Ariadne had defied her monstrous father, King Minos, and abandoned her home for love of Theseus, giving him the thread that guided him through the maze. She had risked everything for him, believing in their shared future. However, during their journey they stopped at Naxos, and there the cruelest twist of fate unfolded. For reasons that still perplex ancient scholars and modern romantics alike, Theseus abandoned Ariadne on Naxos, just left her there. Some myths claim he was commanded to do so by Athena or Hermes, who foresaw her destiny with Dionysus. Others suggest he simply grew tired of her, or perhaps felt she was too much of a burden, or even that he feared the wrath of the gods for carrying off Minos' daughter. Regardless of the exact motive, the act itself was brutal. One moment she was resting on the shore, perhaps asleep or simply distracted. The next she awoke to find his ship a distant speck on the horizon, leaving her utterly alone and heartbroken on a deserted island. Talk about a bad breakup. No text message, no awkward conversation, just gone. Can you imagine the despair? The crushing realization that the hero you risked everything for, the man you loved, had simply sailed away, leaving you stranded and utterly alone. Ariadne's lament is a common theme in ancient poetry, a raw outpouring of grief and betrayal. She was a princess, a hero's savior, now abandoned, vulnerable, and consumed by sorrow. It's the kind of heartbreak that could curdle wine, honestly. But this, dear listener, is where Dionysus steps in. He happened upon Naxos, either returning from his eastern wanderings or simply passing through, drawn by the currents of fate. He found Ariadne weeping on the shore, her heart shattered, her hopes dashed. And being the god of revelry, but also of compassion and transformation, he recognized her plight. He didn't just offer her a sympathetic ear, he offered her a future, a profound destiny, far grander than anything she could have imagined with a mortal hero. A mainstream historical fact here is that the abandonment of Ariadne by Theseus is a pivotal moment in both their myths, often seen as a necessary precursor to her divine apotheosis, becoming a god through her union with Dionysus. It underscores the Greek mythological concept that mortals often serve as instruments of divine will, even if those roles come with immense personal suffering. Historians still argue whether the myth of Ariadne's abandonment reflects ancient marriage customs or serves as a symbolic narrative about the transition from youthful romance to divine partnership. Dionysus, captivated by her beauty and moved by her sorrow, approached her. He didn't just offer comfort. He revealed his true divine nature and proposed marriage. He promised her not just love, but immortality, a place among the gods. This wasn't some rebound fling. This was a divine intervention, a rescue from the depths of despair into the heights of eternal bliss. He offered her a crown, a symbol of her new status, which he later cast into the heavens, where it became the constellation Corona Borealis, the Northern Crown. How's that for an engagement ring? One quirky or fringe tidbit is that some versions of the myth claim that Dionysus found Ariadne already sleeping when he arrived and subtly magically instilled dreams of his coming into her mind, preparing her for his arrival and preventing her from feeling the full shock of her abandonment until he was already there to comfort her. This adds a layer of gentle manipulation, turning her abandonment into a preordained, albeit painful, step towards her higher destiny. So just when it seemed Ariadne's story would end in tragedy and forgotten tears on a lonely island, Dionysus rescued her, not just from the island, but from the very clutches of mortal sorrow. He saw in her not just a heartbroken woman, but a being capable of embracing his ecstatic mysteries, a fitting consort for a god who understood both profound pain and ultimate joy. Her abandonment therefore became less an ending and more a pivotal beginning, transforming a tale of human betrayal into a divine romance. And honestly, after dealing with a narcissistic hero who ditches you, a god who turns your crown into stars is probably a pretty good upgrade. So Ariadne, abandoned and heartbroken on the desolate shores of Naxos, finds herself not sinking further into despair, but being lifted into the arms of a god. This isn't just a casual pickup. It's a divine marriage, a union that solidifies her place among the immortals and further illustrates the unique, often paradoxical nature of Dionysus. He is, after all, the god who brings both ecstatic joy and profound sorrow, and in Ariadne he finds a kindred spirit who has experienced both. Imagine the ceremony, if you can, on that very same island of Naxos. It wouldn't be a quiet, dignified affair like a wedding on Olympus attended by stoic gods in their finest robes. Oh no, this would be a Dionysian wedding, a vibrant explosion of life and revelry. The island would burst forth with new growth, grapevines spontaneously appearing laden with fruit, their tendrils curling around ancient trees. The air would fill with the intoxicating scent of wine, honey, and wild blossoms. Flutes and drums would sound not with stately marches, but with wild rhythmic beats that compelled even the rocks to sway. Dionysus, ever the showman, would be there, not in a stiff toga, but perhaps draped in a leopard skin, his hair crowned with ivy, his eyes sparkling with mirth and profound tenderness. His entourage would be present in full force, the mischievous satyrs, frolicking the frenzied maenads, dancing with uninhibited joy, their thyrsi held high. It would be a celebration of life, of liberation, and of the transformative power of love and divine embrace. Ariadne, once a weeping mortal princess, would be radiant, transformed by the god's touch, shedding her sorrow like an old skin. This marriage to Ariadne is hugely significant for Dionysus. Unlike many of the Olympian gods who had numerous fleeting affairs, Dionysus's union with Ariadne is a lasting, profound relationship. She becomes his primary consort, his divine queen. She embodies the mortal suffering that can lead to divine transcendence, a journey that deeply resonates with Dionysus's own story of persecution and eventual triumph. She's not just a trophy wife. She's a partner who understands the depths of both pain and ecstasy. A mainstream historical fact here is that the myth of Dionysus and Ariadne's marriage became a popular subject in ancient Greek and Roman art, depicting their joyous union and often symbolizing resurrection and apotheosis. The image of Dionysus discovering Ariadne on Naxos is a recurring motif on sarcophagi, suggesting its association with hopes for an afterlife and divine salvation. Historians still argue about the precise theological implications of Ariadne's deification. Was it unique to Dionysus's cult, or part of a broader trend of hero cults? Dionysus didn't just marry her, he made her immortal. He elevated her to the status of a goddess, allowing her to share in his divine power and eternal existence. This act of deification underscores Dionysus's unique role among the Olympians. While other gods might grant favors or offer blessings, Dionysus has the power to fundamentally transform a mortal's essence, to bridge the gap between human and divine, especially for those who embrace his mysteries. And of course, there's that famous act of casting her crown into the heavens, creating the constellation Corona Borealis, ensuring her eternal presence in the night sky. It's a rather romantic gesture, certainly more so than getting turned into a dolphin. One quirky or fringe tidbit is that some versions of the myth suggest that before her marriage to Dionysus, Ariadne had actually died on Naxos, and Dionysus, through his divine power, brought her back to life, literally resurrecting her before making her immortal. This deepens her connection to Dionysus's themes of death and rebirth, mirroring the cycle of the vine itself, which dies in winter and is reborn in spring. It adds another layer to his epithet, twice born. Not just himself, but those he loves can also experience a form of rebirth through him. Ariadne's story provides a beautiful counterpoint to the often brutal tales of Dionysus's retribution. It shows his compassionate side, his capacity for profound love, and his ability to offer redemption to those who have suffered. She becomes a symbol of the ultimate reward for enduring mortal pain, a union with the divine, a life of eternal joy and revelry. She's living proof that sometimes the end of one journey, even a painful one, can be the glorious beginning of another. And all it took was a god with a penchant for wine and a very good eye for a heartbroken princess. So Ariadne is now a divine consort, basking in the eternal revelry of Naxos and the cosmic glow of her constellation. Dionysus has proven himself capable of both terrifying vengeance and profound compassion. He's traveled the world, spread his cult, and even found everlasting love. You'd think by now everyone would be on board with this guy. But oh no, in the ancient Greek world, disrespect for the gods was practically an Olympic sport. Even after all his demonstrations of power, both benevolent and destructive, Dionysus still faced challenges to his divinity. It seems some mortals, and even a few gods, just couldn't wrap their heads around a deity who was less about rigid rules and more about ecstatic liberation. One of the persistent challenges came from the very structure of the Olympian pantheon itself. The established gods like Hera, who, let's be honest, probably still held a grudge, sometimes found Dionysus's wild, often chaotic nature unsettling. He didn't fit neatly into the traditional divine hierarchy. He was too new, too uninhibited, too human in his emotional range despite his immense power. It's like a new charismatic rock star trying to join a very old, very formal symphony orchestra. There's going to be some friction. Beyond the divine skepticism, mortals continued to be wary. Even after the gruesome fates of Lycurgus and Pentheus, there were still those who, out of ignorance, fear, or stubborn pride, refused to acknowledge Dionysus's divine status. They saw his followers as cultists, his rituals as mere drunken orgies, and his wine as a dangerous intoxicant rather than a sacred conduit to the divine. These were often the very people who valued strict social order, tradition, and intellectual control above all else. They simply couldn't comprehend a god who celebrated the loss of self, the temporary shedding of societal norms. Consider the various mortal challenges. We've seen the kings who denied his birthright, but there were also often local communities who would resist the arrival of his maenads, attempting to suppress their ecstatic rituals, viewing them as a threat to their civic peace. These attempts almost invariably backfired, leading to outbreaks of divine madness, strange transformations, or sudden inexplicable outbreaks of fertility in the land, which sounds nice but can be inconvenient if you prefer a predictable harvest. It was a constant game of divine whack-a-mole, where the mole always won. A mainstream historical fact here is that the establishment of new cults, especially those with ecstatic or foreign elements, often met with resistance in ancient Greece. Local authorities and traditional religious institutions sometimes viewed them with suspicion, fearing social disruption or the erosion of established values. This mythological struggle between Dionysus and his deniers reflects very real historical tensions surrounding the adoption and integration of new religious practices. Historians still argue whether the resistance to Dionysus in the myths reflects a genuine historical period of struggle for his cult, or is a symbolic representation of the human struggle with embracing primal forces. One quirky or fringe tidbit about these challenges: some myths speak of minor deities or even local spirits who tried to compete with Dionysus, attempting to offer their own lesser forms of intoxication or revelry. These lesser rivals were predictably, swiftly, and often comically put in their place. Perhaps Dionysus would simply out-party them, or turn their pathetic attempts at wine into vinegar, proving his superiority in the field of good times. It's a subtle nod to the idea that there's only one true master of revelry. Dionysus's response to these continued challenges wasn't always violent. Sometimes it was a subtle display of his power, a reminder of his presence that slowly eroded skepticism. He could make wild animals tame, or cause springs of wine and honey to flow from barren rocks, demonstrating his benevolent dominion over nature. But when challenged directly, especially by those in positions of power, his retribution was swift and often terrifying, designed to break down the very certainties that those who denied him clung to. Ultimately, these challenges, far from diminishing Dionysus, served to solidify his power and define his unique identity. Each act of denial and subsequent divine retribution served as a lesson not just for the individuals involved, but for all of humanity. It taught them that Dionysus was a god who demanded total acceptance, a god who offered profound joy and liberation, but only to those willing to shed their inhibitions and embrace the wild, untamed essence of his mysteries. He was the god who refused to be put in a box, even a very fancy, Olympian-approved box. Having navigated the challenges from stubborn kings and skeptical mortals, and having found his divine consort in Ariadne, Dionysus's story takes another intriguing turn, one that further cements his unique position among the gods. Unlike many Olympians who rarely ventured into the grim realm below, Dionysus, in a surprising act of filial piety, made a journey to the underworld. And his reason for descending into the land of the dead to retrieve his mother, Semele. Remember Semele, the mortal princess who was incinerated when Zeus, bound by an oath, revealed himself in his full divine glory. Well, she was still down there in the gloomy dominion of Hades and Persephone. And Dionysus, despite being born from Zeus's thigh, still held a deep affection and sense of responsibility for his mortal mother. This act of attempting to bring a mortal back from the dead is incredibly rare and highlights Dionysus's compassionate nature, as well as his power to transgress boundaries. Life and death, mortal and immortal. It's like going to the most exclusive underground club in the cosmos, but your goal isn't to party, it's to pick up your mom. The journey to the underworld was no casual stroll. It was a perilous undertaking fraught with dangers and guarded by fearsome entities. Mortals rarely returned from Hades' realm, and even gods approached it with caution. Dionysus, however, was determined. He sought out a guide, sometimes said to be a mortal, named Prosimnus, who in a slightly awkward twist allegedly demanded sexual favors as payment, a request Dionysus promised to fulfill upon his return. A promise he kept even after Prosimnus died, using a figwood phallus on his tomb. Yes, Greek myths get weird. Other versions simply state he found a hidden secret path, perhaps through the depths of a lake or a chasm. Once in the underworld, Dionysus had to negotiate with Hades and Persephone, the formidable rulers of the dead. These were not gods to be trifled with, and retrieving a soul, especially one consumed by divine fire, was no easy feat. Dionysus likely used his unique charm and persuasive powers, perhaps offering them something they valued, or simply impressing them with his divine status and the sheer audacity of his request. It's a testament to his growing power and influence that he was even allowed to make such a plea, let alone succeed. A mainstream historical fact here is that descents into the underworld known as katabasis are a recurring motif in Greek mythology, undertaken by heroes like Odysseus, Heracles, and Orpheus. These journeys often symbolize a profound initiation or a conquest over death, and Dionysus's journey places him in the company of these legendary figures, further elevating his status. Historians still argue about the exact significance of Dionysus's katabasis for his cult, Was it a literal belief in resurrection for his followers, or a symbolic journey of renewal and initiation? The success of his mission underscores Dionysus's connection to themes of death and rebirth, a cycle deeply embedded in his worship. Just as the vine appears to die in winter, only to reborn in spring, Dionysus has the power to bring life from death, to transform sorrow into joy, and to bridge the gap between worlds. This journey to retrieve Semele is a powerful manifestation of that transformative power, proving that his influence extended even to the very boundaries of existence. One quirky or fringe tidbit about this journey is that Dionysus supposedly traded something immensely valuable for Semele's release. Not gold or jewels, but perhaps a sacred knowledge or a ritual that would benefit the rulers of the underworld. Some accounts suggest he gave them the gift of the Dionysian mysteries themselves, promising Hades and Persephone the souls of those who truly embraced his revelry in life. This paints a picture of a clever, strategic god willing to barter for the love of his mother. Upon successfully bringing Semele back from the underworld, Dionysus didn't just leave her on Earth. He took her to Olympus, where she was deified and became the goddess Thyone. This was an extraordinary act. A mortal previously incinerated, now resurrected and elevated to divine status among the Olympians. It was a triumph not just for Dionysus, but for the very concept of overcoming death and achieving immortality through divine connection. And you can bet Hera wasn't thrilled about this development, but by this point Dionysus was too powerful to defy openly. He'd brought his mom to the ultimate family reunion, whether his stepmom liked it or not. So Dionysus has successfully defied death, brought his mortal mother back from the underworld, and even managed to get her a gig as a goddess on Olympus. You'd think after all that globe-trotting divine vengeance, and even a romantic constellation creation, he'd finally be universally acknowledged. And indeed, this act of elevating Semele, his once mortal mother, was a powerful statement that solidified his place. We now arrive at the point of his divine council acceptance, his formal recognition within the Olympian pantheon. Remember how Dionysus was initially hidden from Hera, how he endured a childhood on the run, and how even later, kings and mortals challenged his very divinity. Well, by now, those days are largely over. His power had become undeniable. His cult was spreading rapidly across the Greek world, transforming landscapes and minds. He had demonstrated his benevolence to those who embraced him, and his terrifying retribution to those who resisted. He had even shown his ability to conquer death itself. At some point, even the most stubborn of gods, namely Hera, had to concede. It's like inviting that eccentric, wildly talented cousin to the family reunion. They might cause a bit of a stir, but eventually everyone realizes they bring the best stories and the most interesting dishes. The integration of Dionysus into the 12 Olympian gods wasn't necessarily a smooth, unanimous vote, mind you. The existing Olympians had their established pecking order and their ingrained prejudices. Some might have still seen him as a new god, or as a reminder of Zeus's various dalliances. But Zeus, being his father, and having personally invested in his gestation, remember, the Thigh was keen to see his son recognized. Besides, Dionysus held a domain that no other god truly commanded: the intoxicating power of wine, the ecstatic release of inhibition, the raw, untamed energy of nature. This was a unique and potent sphere of influence too significant to ignore. A mainstream historical fact here is that the composition of the 12 Olympians was not always fixed and varied in different periods and regions of ancient Greece. However, Dionysus's inclusion, often replacing Hestia, the goddess of the hearth who sometimes voluntarily gave up her seat, signifies his undeniable importance and integration into the core Greek pantheon by the classical period. This historical fluidity of the Olympian lineup reflects the dynamic nature of ancient Greek religion, adapting and incorporating new deities or shifting emphasis over time. Historians still argue whether Dionysus was originally a foreign god who was later Hellenized and adopted by the Greeks, or if he was an indigenous deity whose worship evolved to include ecstatic elements. His acceptance meant that he had a seat at the cosmic table, participating in the divine governance of the world. He was no longer just the god of drunken revelry. He was a legitimate power whose decrees held weight and whose worship was sanctioned. This gave his cult an official legitimacy, encouraging more people to embrace his mysteries without fear of divine disapproval from the established order. It's like getting official approval for your slightly wild but ultimately successful new business venture. One quirky or fringe tidbit is that some accounts suggest Dionysus's entrance to Olympus was marked by him bringing a special, potent vintage of wine that even the other gods accustomed to ambrosia and nectar found irresistible. He might have thrown the ultimate welcome party, demonstrating his unique abilities and charm in a way that simply won over the skeptics. Imagine Hades, usually gloomy, chuckling after a sip of Dionysus's finest, or stern Athena loosening up just enough to tap her foot to a satyr's flute. Dionysus's permanent place on Olympus marked the culmination of his arduous journey. From a hidden child to a global wanderer, from a persecuted outcast to a powerful, universally recognized deity, he had truly come into his own. His presence on Olympus also brought a new dynamic to the divine assembly. He represented spontaneity, passion, and the breaking of boundaries, a powerful counterpoint to the more rigid and orderly aspects represented by gods like Apollo or Hera. He brought a wild creative energy that invigorated the divine sphere. So finally Dionysus was home, not just in a geographical sense, but in a cosmic one. He had earned his place not through brute force alone, but through his unique gifts, his resilience, and his profound connection to the human spirit. The era of denying Dionysus was officially over. From now on, it was simply a matter of learning to live with and ideally celebrate the god of wine revelry and boundless liberation. And honestly, for the Olympians, life probably got a lot more interesting once he joined the club. So Dionysus has finally secured his place on Olympus, a full-fledged member of the divine inner circle. But his acceptance didn't mean he suddenly became a quiet, well-behaved deity, sipping nectar politely and attending endless divine council meetings. Oh no. Dionysus is the god of the Bacchae and his cults, and these were anything but sedate. This is where his influence truly comes alive, spilling out of the divine realm and into the very fabric of human experience, offering a pathway to ecstasy that was both alluring and at times terrifying. The Dionysian cults were unique among ancient Greek religions. Unlike the more formal, civic-oriented worship of other Olympians, Dionysus's rites were often characterized by their ecstatic, emotional, and sometimes wild nature. They were not confined to grand temples in city centers. Instead, they often took place in wild, untamed spaces, on mountainsides, in forests, under the cloak of night. This emphasized the raw, primal connection to nature that was central to his worship. Imagine a moonlight rave, but with less EDM and more panthers. The core of his cult involved ritual madness known as mania and ecstatic dance. His female followers, the Maenads, also called Bacchae, hence the play's name, would don fawn skins, carry the thyrsus, a staff entwined with ivy and topped with a pine cone, and often wear snakes in their hair. They would dance themselves into a frenzy, their movements becoming increasingly wild and uninhibited, sometimes lasting through the night. This wasn't just a dance, it was a physical and spiritual journey, a means to achieve ecstasy, literally standing outside oneself, a temporary transcendence of their mortal bodies and everyday consciousness to commune directly with the god. During these rituals, the Maenads were believed to possess superhuman strength and an ability to charm wild animals. They could tear apart sacrificial animals, sparagmos, and then consume their raw flesh, homophagia, a symbolic act of communion with the god, absorbing his primal energy. While these details sound gruesome, it's important to remember they were ritualistic acts, deeply symbolic of the cycles of death and rebirth, central to Dionysus's domain. It's a mainstream historical fact that while these myths describe extreme practices, actual archaeological evidence suggests that while Dionysian cults were indeed ecstatic and celebrated wine, the most violent elements like sparagmos and omophagia were likely symbolic or reserved for rare, highly ritualized events rather than common practice. Historians still argue about the literal interpretation of these rites and whether they truly involved human participants tearing animals apart. The cult of Dionysus offered something fundamentally different from the established religious practices. It offered liberation from social constraints, from the burdens of daily life, and from the strictures of reason. It was an embrace of the irrational, the intuitive, and the primal. For women in particular, who often lived highly restricted lives in ancient Greek society, the Dionysian rites offered a rare opportunity for communal expression and temporary freedom from patriarchal norms. They could escape the confines of the oikos household and explore a wilder, more powerful aspect of their femininity. Dionysus, as the god of masks and illusion, also inspired the development of Greek theater. The earliest forms of drama evolved from Dionysian rituals, particularly the dithyramb, a choral hymn sung in his honor. The masks worn by actors, the transformative power of performance, and the very idea of stepping into another character's shoes all stem from the core principles of Dionysian ecstasy and the blurring of identity. It's a quirky tidbit that the word tragedy itself is thought by some to derive from tragoidia, meaning goat song, perhaps referring to the sacrificial goat or the satyr chorus in early Dionysian rites. So next time you see a play, remember you have a god of wine to thank. The nature of Dionysus's worship was fluid and diverse. It encompassed both wild public processions, theosoi, and secret initiation rituals, mysteries that promised spiritual insights and a blessed afterlife. It attracted people from all walks of life, regardless of social status, gender, or origin. This inclusivity was another radical aspect of his cult, challenging the rigid social hierarchies of the time. He offered a sense of belonging, a shared experience of transcendence, uniting individuals in a collective ecstatic frenzy. So while he might have had a reserved seat on Olympus, Dionysus's true domain was among his fervent followers in the wild places and within the human heart. His cults represented a powerful, enduring force in ancient Greece, a testament to humanity's enduring need for release, for transcendence, and for a bit of divine madness. And it all revolved around the intoxicating power of the vine and the god who mastered it. All right, we've journeyed through Dionysus's fiery birth, his global travels, his dealings with defiant kings and curious pirates, and his ultimate acceptance on Olympus, all while exploring the wild heart of his ecstatic cults. But you, dear listener, have been patiently waiting for the answer to our original, intriguing question, why Dionysus once hid in a barrel of wine. This isn't one of the grand epic tales like his dismemberment of Pentheus or his rescue of Ariadne, but rather a quirky, more understated moment that perfectly encapsulates his essence, his vulnerability, his connection to his sacred liquid, and his cleverness when faced with unexpected threats. This particular story is less about monumental divine retribution and more about a momentary strategic retreat, a temporary hiding, or perhaps even a symbolic act. While there are many myths where Dionysus directly confronts his enemies, sometimes he's depicted as eluding them, especially in his younger years or when faced with overwhelming opposition. And what better place for the god of wine to hide than in a barrel of his own sacred vintage? It's the ancient Greek equivalent of a superhero hiding in a phone booth, but way more on brand. One version of this tale connects back to his ongoing persecution by Hera. Even after his official acceptance on Olympus, Hera's resentment towards Zeus's illegitimate offspring, especially one as popular and boundary-breaking as Dionysus, never truly faded. She might have sent one of her many agents, a minor deity or a giant, to track him down during one of his earthly sojourns, perhaps catching him at a moment when he was less prepared for a direct confrontation. Or perhaps, in a fit of pique, she just created a particularly nasty monster that even Dionysus preferred to avoid directly for a moment. Imagine the scene: Dionysus, perhaps enjoying a quiet afternoon amongst his grapevines, or perhaps just having concluded a particularly vigorous ritual with his followers, when suddenly he senses trouble. A looming threat, something powerful and unpleasant sent by his ever-vigilant stepmother. He couldn't simply vanish, not without revealing his presence and power. So he looked around for the most inconspicuous yet perfectly fitting hiding spot. And there it was, a large, freshly filled barrel of wine. This wasn't just any barrel. It was likely one brimming with his own divine creation, a vessel imbued with his essence. Slipping into it, he would have been completely submerged, shrouded by the rich, intoxicating liquid. The wine itself would have acted as a sort of camouflage, masking his divine scent and energy from his pursuer. It's a very Dionysian solution to a problem. Instead of fighting directly, he submerges himself in his element, becoming one with his power. It's like a spy hiding in plain sight, but with a delicious aroma. A mainstream historical fact here is that large ceramic storage jars, or pithoi, were commonly used in ancient Greece for storing wine, olive oil, and grain. These vessels were often large enough for a person to hide inside, as famously depicted in the myth of Diogenes the Cynic, living in a pythos. So the idea of hiding in such a container would have been familiar to an ancient Greek audience, making the imagery relatable, even for a divine being. Historians still argue whether this specific myth of Dionysus hiding in a wine barrel is a very ancient, obscure variant, or a later, perhaps more humorous addition to his extensive cycle of myths. This particular story, while not as dramatic as the sagas of Oedipus or the Trojan War, reveals something fundamental about Dionysus. It highlights his deep, almost symbiotic connection to wine. It's not just something he makes, it's something he is. His essence is intertwined with the fermented grape, making the barrel not just a hiding place, but an extension of his very being. It's a humorous and telling moment, showing a divine being using the tools of his trade in a very practical, if slightly undignified way. One quirky or fringe tidbit is that some interpretations suggest this act of hiding in the barrel isn't just about escape, but also about a symbolic immersion and renewal, a temporary withdrawal into his deepest essence before re-emerging with renewed power. It's a microcosmic representation of his themes of death and rebirth, a small descent into his own liquid underworld before his eventual resurrection from the barrel. It's a quiet moment of vulnerability, transformed into a powerful symbol of his domain. So the next time you see a barrel of wine, remember that within its depths, the god of revelry himself might have once found refuge. It's a charming, slightly absurd image that reminds us that even gods have their moments of needing a good hiding spot. And for Dionysus, that spot was always going to be the most perfectly on-brand location imaginable. And so from being hidden in a barrel of his own divine vintage, Dionysus emerges perhaps a little sticky but entirely unharmed and ready to resume his eternal revelry. We've journeyed through his tumultuous birth, his perilous childhood, his triumphant travels across continents, and his dramatic encounters with mortals and gods alike. We've seen him as the god of both joyous liberation and terrifying retribution, the deity who brought both intoxicating bliss and devastating madness. Now as our sleepy journey through his myth draws to a close, we consider his legacy and enduring influence. Dionysus, arguably more than any other Greek god, left an indelible mark on Greek culture, a legacy that continues to echo through art philosophy and even our modern understanding of human nature. He wasn't just a god you prayed to for a good harvest of grapes. He was a god who offered a transformative experience, a path to understanding the wild, irrational, and often profound depths of the human psyche. He embodied the idea that truth isn't always found in logical discourse or rigid structure, but sometimes in the ecstatic, uninhibited abandonment of the self. His most visible and perhaps most profound legacy is undoubtedly his connection to Greek theater. As we touched upon earlier, the very origins of tragedy and comedy are steeped in Dionysian rituals, the masked performances, the chorus, the cathartic release experienced by the audience. All these elements are deeply rooted in the concept of ecstasy and the temporary shedding of identity that Dionysus championed. When you watch a play, whether it's a Greek tragedy or a modern musical, you are in a very real sense participating in a ritual inherited from the worship of the god of wine. Think about it, sitting in a darkened room, allowing yourself to be transported by a story, feeling emotions stirred within you. It's a form of collective release, a modern echo of ancient revelry. Beyond the stage, Dionysus's influence permeated philosophy. Philosophers like Friedrich Nietzsche, centuries later, would famously draw upon the Apollonian representing order, reason light, and Dionysian representing chaos, passion, darkness, dichotomy, to describe fundamental forces in art and human existence. Nietzsche saw the Dionysian as essential for true artistic creation and genuine experience, arguing that a life purely lived by Apollonian reason would be stifling and incomplete. This philosophical concept, derived directly from Dionysus's character, continues to shape discussions on art psychology and the human condition. It's a mainstream historical fact that Nietzsche's The Birth of Tragedy is a foundational text in understanding this concept. Historians still argue about the extent to which Nietzsche's interpretation accurately reflects ancient Greek religious practice versus his own philosophical agenda. Dionysus also represents the constant tension between civilization and the wild, between order and chaos. His cults, with their ecstatic mountain revels, stood in stark contrast to the ordered city-states and their rational governance. Yet he was ultimately integrated into that order, signifying that society, to be truly whole, must acknowledge and integrate its own wild, irrational impulses. He reminds us that sometimes we need to let loose, to dance, to sing, to connect with something primal and untamed within ourselves, lest we become too rigid, too stifled, or too boring. His enduring appeal lies in his universality, the desire for transcendence, for escape, for joy, for connection to something larger than oneself. These are deeply human urges. Dionysus, through his wine and his mysteries, offered a direct pathway to these experiences. He showed that divinity could be found not just in distant thunderbolts, but in the warmth of the grape, in the rhythm of the dance, and in the communal embrace of shared experience. He was a god for the common people, for the marginalized, for anyone seeking liberation. Even today you can see his echoes. In every celebration, every toast, every moment of communal joy and release, there's a whisper of Dionysus. In the blurring of lines on a dance floor, in the emotional power of a theatrical performance, in the feeling of being utterly lost in the moment. That's the Dionysian spirit, alive and well, reminding us to embrace the messy, beautiful chaos of life. One final quirky or fringe tidbit. Some scholars suggest that the very resilience of the grapevine, its ability to thrive in varied climates and regenerate after being pruned perfectly, mirrors Dionysus's own history of persecution, death, and rebirth. The vine is a living symbol of his enduring power and influence, constantly offering new life and new intoxication, just as Dionysus continually offers renewal to those who seek him. And so we conclude our journey with Dionysus, the twice-born god of wine, revelry, and madness. He taught us that sometimes the most profound truths are found not in quiet contemplation, but in ecstatic abandon. He taught us that even gods have their vulnerabilities, and sometimes the best place to hide is in a barrel of your own product. And he reminds us in the end that life, like a good vintage, is meant to be savored, celebrated, and sometimes a little bit wild. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together.